Chapter 3, The Goat's Ladder. The wind off the North Sea did not merely blow, it bit. It carried the microscopic shards of the high glaciers, whipping them against the bare skin of the men who clung to the dark, wet schist of the mountain. They had left their mail shirts in a heap among the ashes of Hunstock, looking like the shed skins of iron serpents. Now, clad only in thick woolen tunics, leather breeches, and soft-soled hide boots, 60 men crawled up the vertical spine of the ridge. Thorstein went first. His fingers were no longer fingers, they were numb, bleeding hooks that sought out every crack, every frozen root, every ledge no wider than a knife's edge. Viper's tongue was slung across his back, the leather wrap around its blade cold against his spine. "Don't look down, Halvar," Thorstein hissed into the darkness above the roar of the gale. A dozen paces below him, the boy was clinging to a slab of black rock that ran slick with freezing condensation. A single misstep meant a fall of 400 paces into the jagged teeth of the fjord's shingle. There would be no burial mound for a man who fell from the ladder, the tide would have his bones before the sun rose. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the dark. A stone the size of a horse's head had broken loose from the shelf above. It plunged through the night, striking the cliff face with a shower of orange sparks. A muffled scream followed. It was young Erling's cousin, a lad of 17 winters named Thorin. He hadn't even the time to call upon Odin before the rock took him. The sound of his body hitting the scree far below was lost in the howling of the wind, but the silence that followed among the climbing men was heavier than any thunder. "Keep moving," Thorstein growled, his teeth grinding until they ached. "If you stop, the frost will lock your knees. Move." The lip of the well. After what felt like 3 lifetimes in the dark, Thorstein's hand encountered something that was not frozen stone, it was horizontal timber. He had reached the base of the ridge fort's rear palisade. Unlike the front gate, which was guarded by 2 heavy towers and a ditch of sharpened stakes, this side faced the abyss. Jarl Eric's men had built the wall right to the edge of the cliff, believing that only crows and spirits could approach from the west. Thorstein hoisted himself up onto a narrow ledge of dirt just beneath the logs. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. One by one, the dark shapes of his men spilled over the lip behind him. Kveldulv arrived, his face white from the exertion, his massive hands trembling as he gripped his great axe. "The wind is a whore," the giant wheezed, spitting a mouthful of bloody phlegm onto the wood. Thorstein held up a hand. Above them, on the other side of the pine-log palisade, they could hear the sounds of celebration. Jarl Eric's huskarls had found the village ale stores. There were shouts, the coarse laughter of men who believed they had already won the day, and the rhythmic thumping of iron cups against oak tables. "They are drunk on my brother's mead," Halvar whispered, his teeth chattering from the cold, but his eyes burning like hot coals. "Then it will be the last thing they taste," Thorstein said. He leaned against the palisade, searching for a gap. The logs were old, lashed together with heavy hemp ropes that had rotted from the salt air. He found a section where the timber had shifted, leaving a gap wide enough for a hand. Thorstein slipped his long sax, the single-edged scramasax, from its sheath. He didn't use his axe yet, an axe was for the open field, for the noise of the shield wall. Here, they needed the silence of the knife. The shadow in the yard. Thorstein wriggled through a gap where the earth had eroded beneath the logs, dragging himself into the dirt of the fort's inner yard. The air inside smelled different, of horse dung, roasting mutton, and the sour stink of cheap grain spirit. A fire pit blazed 30 paces away, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of the Jarl's hall. A single guard stood near the horse stables, leaning heavily against a spear. His helmet was tilted back, and he was humming a tune from the southern lands, his mind miles away from the freezing dark of the cliffside. Thorstein rose from the shadows like grease rising on water. His boots made no sound on the packed earth. He was 5 paces away when the guard turned. The man's eyes widened, reflecting the orange light of the fire pit, but before he could draw breath to yell, Thorstein closed the distance. His left hand clamped over the guard's mouth, the leather glove stifling the sound into a dull grunt. At the same instant, Thorstein drove his sax upward, just beneath the man's jaw, through the soft tongue root and into the brain. The guard's body went limp immediately, his spear clattering into the straw. Thorstein lowered him gently, his eyes already sweeping the yard. Behind him, Kveldolv and Halvar were through the wall, followed by 30 more men. The rest were still climbing, but they could not wait. The fire pit was dying, and someone would soon come out to tend it or to relieve the watch. Halvar, take 3 men and secure the stable doors. Don't let them get to the horses, Thorstein ordered in a low whisper. Kveldolv, with me to the heavy doors of the hall. We bar them from the outside if we can, or we go in if we must. Let's go in, Kveldolv grinned, a feral, terrifying look in the firelight. I want to see the Jarl's face when he realizes the dead have come up from the sea. The breaking of the feast. They never reached the doors. The heavy oak portals of the great hall swung open with a bang, and a man stumbled out into the yard, holding an empty earthenware jug. It was one of the Jarl's captains, a man known as Thorstein the Red, his beard stained with spilled ale. He looked straight at Thorstein. For 2 heartbeats, the only sound was the wind howling outside the walls and the crackle of the pine knots in the fire pit. Sigurdsson? Thorstein the Red muttered, squinting through the gloom as if seeing a ghost. You're dead. The ships took you at the mouth. The sea didn't want us, Thorstein said. The captain opened his mouth to roar, but Thorstein didn't give him the breath. He threw his sacks. The heavy blade turned once in the air, entering Thorstein the Red's throat with a heavy thunk. The man staggered backward, his hands grasping at the horn hilt sticking out of his neck, before crashing into the hall doors. The noise inside the hall died instantly. To me! Thorstein bellowed, discarding all silence now. He reached behind his back and drew Viper's tongue, the iron head gleaming under the torchlight. Hardinja! Odin! The men of the Naglfar's wake roared back. A primal, starving sound that tore through the mountain fort. They charged the doors just as the Jarl's huskarls inside scrambled for their weapons, the feast turning into a slaughterhouse before the first horn could be blown. Chapter 4, The Hall of Split Timber. The great doors of the hall did not slam shut, they were jammed by the twitching corpse of Thorstein the Red. Thorstein Sigurdsson hit the oak panel's shoulder first, driving his weight into the wood just as 2 huskarls on the inside tried to force it close. The timber groaned, iron hinges shrieking against the stone frame, and then the barrier gave way. Thorstein tumbled into the heat, the grease, and the blinding light of the great hall. The air inside was thick enough to chew. It smelled of spilled meat, roasting marrow, fat, and the unwashed wool of 80 men who had thought themselves safe behind stone and mountain. The cliff, someone screamed from the high tables at the back. They came up the cliff. Before the words had even cleared the man's teeth, Kveldolv stepped through the threshold. He didn't have room to swing his giant Danax in the narrow entryway, so he used it like a ram, driving the heavy iron-bound ash shaft straight into the chest of an oncoming warrior. The man's ribs snapped with the sound of dry pine branches under a boot, and he was thrown back into the central fire trench. The hall was a long, narrow tunnel of violence. Down the center ran the fire pit, filled with glowing peat coals that threw a hellish orange glare onto the rafter beams above. On either side were the long benches, now overturned as men scrambled for shields, axes, and swords that had been hung carelessly on the walls. Form the wedge! Thorstein roared, his axe Viper's tongue swinging in a short, vicious circle that cleaved the hand of a man reaching for a spear. Halvar! Keep the door behind us! The red tallow! There was no room for tactical grace. This was the Hogva, the hacking water. Thorstein advanced down the left side of the fire trench, his boots slipping on spilled grease and tallow. A huskarl rushed him, swinging a heavy Frankish sword. Thorstein caught the blow on his forearm, not on mail, for he had left it at the beach, but on the thick, boiled leather bracer he wore. The iron bit into the leather, stopping an inch from his bone. Thorstein didn't flinch. He wrenched his arm back, pulling the man's blade out of line, and drove the iron beak of his axe into the side of the man's knee. The joint shattered. As the warrior fell to his face, Thorstein finished him with a short, heavy stomp to the base of the skull. Sigurdsson! Through the smoke and the steam of the meat vats, a massive figure rose from the high seat at the end of the hall. It was not Jarl Erik, the Jarl was too old, too fat to leave his hall at Alrekstad. but his warlord, Halder the Black. Halder was a man built like an old oak trunk. His beard was black as charcoal, bound with silver wire, and his eyes were wide and yellowed with the ale rage. He wore a heavy coat of ringmail that came down to his knees, and in his right hand, he held a massive broadsword, its pommel shaped like a coiled serpent. "You should have drowned in the fjord, Thorstein," Halder bellowed, stepping down from the dais. He didn't look at his men who were falling around him. His eyes were locked on Thorstein's grey beard. "I killed your brother. I watched his blood freeze on the stone. I will have your tongue for a belt strap." "Come get it, dog," Thorstein said, his voice dropping into a cold, flat calm. The clash of old iron. The men around them fell back, creating a ragged ring of bloody wood and mud between the fire trench and the high benches. The battle still raged at the door, where Halvar and the younger men were holding off the Jarl's watchmen from the outer walls, but here, in the heart of the hall, the air went quiet save for the heavy breathing of two old killers. Halder struck first. For a man of his size, he moved with the speed of a striking adder. The serpent-hilted sword whistled through the smoke, a horizontal cut aimed at Thorstein's neck. Thorstein ducked beneath the blade, the wind of its passage whistling over his hair. He lunged forward, aiming a thrust with the point of viper's tongue at Halder's unarmored throat. But Halder was no farmer. He anticipated the move, dropping his heavy iron-rimmed shield down to intercept the axe head. The iron clattered against iron. Halder twisted his shield, trapping Thorstein's axe blade between the wood and the iron rim, and brought his sword down in a short, brutal arc aimed at Thorstein's shoulder. Thorstein couldn't pull his axe free in time. He threw himself to the left, but the sword still found him. It tore through his woolen tunic and bit deep into the muscle of his left shoulder. Blood, hot and dark, spurted out, soaking his sleeve instantly. "Uncle!" Halvar screamed from the door, but the boy was buried under two attackers and couldn't break away. Thorstein didn't cry out. The pain was there, a white-hot spike in his flesh, but he had lived with iron long enough to know that pain only kills if you let it look you in the eye. He let go of his axe haft with his left hand, leaving Viper's tongue stuck in Halder's shield, and drew his short sax from his hip with his right. The law of the knife. Halder laughed, a wet, confident sound, and raised his sword for the killing blow. "Die in the dark, Sigurdsson." He swung. But instead of blocking or dodging, Thorstein stepped into the blow. He let the flat of Halder's sword strike his injured shoulder, using the very momentum of the hit to drive himself inside the giant's reach, where the long sword was useless. They slammed together chest to chest. The iron rings of Halder's mailshirt dug into Thorstein's skin. Halder's breath smelled of old meat and stale ale, his yellow eyes widening in sudden, sharp realization. Thorstein's right arm was free. He didn't swing the sax, he used it like a chisel. He drove the heavy, single-edged blade upward, beneath the rim of Halder's mailshirt, right into the soft flesh of the groin where the femoral artery ran thick and deep. Halder stiffened. His sword dropped from his fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Thorstein didn't pull the blade out. He twisted it, 90 degrees, horizontal to the bone, and leaned his entire weight onto the hilt. "That," Thorstein whispered into Halder's ear, his voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire, "is for Sigmund. That is for the law." Halder's yellow eyes rolled back into his head. A great, shuddering breath escaped his lips, carrying with it a spray of red foam, and then the giant collapsed forward, pinning Thorstein to the ground under his immense, mail-clad weight. The Ash King. For a moment, the hall was silent save for the roaring of the fire trench. Thorstein crawled out from beneath the dead warlord, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, his right hand dripping with Halder's lifeblood. He reached down, wrenched Viper's tongue from the dead man's shield, and used the shaft to steady himself as he stood up on the high dais. The remaining Huskarls, seeing their leader stuck like a pig, lost their stomach for the iron. They dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in the bloody straw, their hands raised in the ancient sign of submission. Kveldulv approached the dais, his face covered in soot and blood that was not his own. He looked at Thorstein's shoulder, then at the dead warlord on the floor. "The fort is ours," Kveldulv said, his breath coming in long, ragged gasps. "But Jarl Erik will hear of this before the moon turns. He will bring the whole western fleet, Thorstein. He will bring 300 ships. Thorstein looked out through the shattered doors of the hall, past the burning village below, toward the cold, grey horizon where the first light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sea. "Let him come," Thorstein said, lifting Viper's tongue high so the remaining men could see the blood on its iron edge. "He thinks he is the Jarl of the land. But from this day until the crows have my meat, we are the kings of the ash." Chapter 7, The Wolf Feast. The howl did not die, it grew wider, expanding until it filled the ears of every living man in the courtyard like the roaring of a collapsed mine. Sigurd the Fat's huskarls, frozen with their blades half raised, looked up toward the high, jagged rim of the western scree. To them, the mountain was supposed to be a wall of dead stone. But now, through the grey mountain mist, the shapes came. They did not march. They dropped from the boulders on all fours before straightening into long, bounding strides, their feet bare against the frozen granite, their bodies wrapped in the grey, unpeeled skins of timber wolves. They carried no shields, no heavy ringmail, and no iron helmets to protect their eyes. In their hands were long, rusted scythes, heavy butcher cleavers, and clubs bound with iron horseshoes. At their head ran Kveldol's nephew, a youth whose skin had been tattooed with walnut juice until his face looked like a knot of ancient oak. He was not screaming names or gods, a thick, yellow foam ran from the corners of his mouth, and his eyes were completely white, the pupils rolled back into his skull. Ulfnar, a Danish mercenary, yelled, his voice rising to a frantic, thin shriek. He dropped his sword and turned to run back toward the gate, but the crowd of his own comrades blocked his way. The wolfcoats are down from the high snow. The breaking of the rears. The impact of the mountain men against Sigurd's rearguard was not the clean clack of a shield wall meeting steel. It was the sound of iron hitting meat. The foremost wolfcoat, a giant whose grey beard was matted with dried seal tallow, leaped from a 6-foot ledge straight onto the shoulders of a mail-clad captain. He did not use an axe. He drove his bare fingers into the eye slits of the captain's iron helmet, ripping the man backward into the dirt while his teeth sought the soft flesh where the neck met the collarbone. The Jarl's men, packed tightly into the narrow throat of the well path, could not turn their shields around to face the new threat. The long sides of the Ulfnar reaped them from behind, hooking into the backs of knees, parting mail links with brutal, horizontal sweeps that left the stones slick with green belly grease. Thorstein! Kveldol's voice cut through the madness. The giant was covered in soot from the gateway, but his eyes were bright with a terrible, newborn joy. The bones spoke. The wolfcoats have accepted the debt. Hardinja! Thorstein roared, the grey mist clearing from his eyes as the iron surge came back into his blood. He lifted Viper's tongue, its bearded edge dripping red tallow. The wall is open. Push them into the throat. Drive them down to the water. The 60 men who remained of the Naglfar's wake surged forward from the wellhouse. They were no longer defending a gate. They were the hammer hitting the anvil, and Sigurd's huskarls were the iron being beaten between them and the wolfcoats. The throat of the pass. Thorstein cut his way through the center of the gatehouse, his boots stepping over bodies that were still twitching in the mud. A huskarl tried to clear space with a short sword, but Thorstein caught the man's wrist with his left hand, ignoring the white-hot scream of pain from his torn shoulder, and drove the butt spike of Viper's tongue straight through the man's iron noseguard. The bone split like a dry hemlock knot. Through the gap, Thorstein could see the lower beach. Sigurd the Fat was no longer on the deck of the Iron Beak. He had come ashore to watch the gate break, and now he was trapped at the base of the path, surrounded by 4 of his personal guards who were trying to pull him back into a rowing skiff. His face, normally the color of an old turnip from too much lard and mead, was now as white as a fresh-peeled willow branch. Sigurd! Thorstein bellowed, his voice carrying over the screams of the dying. The fat warlord looked up, his yellow teeth bared in fear as he saw the grey-bearded man coming down the path like an ash tree sliding down a muddy cliff. Hold him! Sigurd screamed to his guards, his fat fingers gripping the gunwale of the skiff. A farm in the south to the man who brings me his head. The 4 guards, older men whose burnies were heavy with silver rings from long service, stepped forward, their long swords forming an iron fence across the shingle. The price of the name. Thorstein did not stop his run. He knew his left arm was finished, the fingers were curling into a dead knot, and his breath was whistling through his teeth in a way that told him his ribs were broken beneath his tunic. He had only one swing left in Viper's tongue before his grip failed entirely. He didn't swing at the guards. As he reached the sand, he threw his entire body weight into a low, sliding tackle against the knees of the first two men. The impact brought them down into the wet kelp. Before the other two could bring their blades down on his exposed back, a great red shadow fell over them. Kveldolv had leaped from the path above. His 5-foot axe came down like a woodcutter's wedge, clearing both guards from Torstein's flank in a single, horizontal spray of white bone and grey brain matter. Torstein crawled through the red surf, his right hand still locked around the ash haft of his axe. Sigurd the Fat was in the skiff now, his bondmen straining at the oars to push the heavy boat into the deep water of the fjord. The boat was 3 paces out, the waves bubbling around its prow. Torstein stood up, the ice water coming to his waist. He reached out with his right arm, his muscles tearing under the strain, and caught the iron dragon tail that formed the stern of the boat. The lawspeaker had 5 sons, Sigurd, Torstein whispered, his voice so hoarse it sounded like the sea grinding the shingle. Sigurd turned, drawing a short, silver-mounted dagger from his belt, his eyes wild. "Let go, you old dog. The Jarl will skin you alive. He will leave you for the gulls." "The gulls are already full," Torstein said. He did not use the blade of Viper's tongue. He used his bare right hand to reach up, grabbing Sigurd by the silver-bound braids of his hair, and hauled the heavy man backward out of the boat into the freezing surf. The splash was heavy, the white foam turning red instantly as Torstein's short-sacks found the gap beneath Sigurd's fat chin, sliding through the throat until the iron point struck the gravel of the fjord bed below. The quiet water. The skiff drifted out into the mist, its rowers too terrified to turn back for a dead master. Torstein stood alone in the knee-deep water, leaning heavily on the shaft of his axe, his breath coming in short, rattling gasps that threw a thin vapor into the cold air. Behind him, on the path and around the gatehouse, the screaming was beginning to die down into a low, rhythmic growl as the Lfnar began their search of the dead for iron and salt. Halvar walked down to the edge of the water, his spear broken in half, his face covered in a mixture of soot and his own young blood. He looked at the fat corpse floating face down in the weeds by Torstein's boots. "The fleet is turning back, uncle," the boy said, pointing out toward the mouth of the fjord. Through the parting mist, the remaining 35 longships of the Jarl's armada could be seen backing water, their oars moving in reverse as they saw the red shore and the wolfcoats standing on the headland. They had no stomach for a mountain that ate huskarls. Torstein looked at his nephew, then up at the ridge where the ancient stone circle of the Thingstead stood against the grey sky. "They will be back before the hay is cut, Halvar," Torstein said, his hand slipping from his axe shaft as he sat down heavily on a wet boulder. "The Jarl cannot let a broken gate stand." "Then we will be here," Halvar said, his voice no longer that of a boy. He reached down, lifted Viper's tongue from the sand, and held it out to his uncle. Torstein looked at the iron edge, then at the grey horizon where the crows were finally landing on the stones of Hunstock. "No," Torstein whispered, his eyes closing as the long dark finally came down from the peaks. "Not here. The next time we fight, we row for Alrekstad. If the Jarl wants our wood, we will give him his own hall to burn." Chapter 8, The Iron Hearth. The ice did not melt that spring, it simply turned grey and rotted into the black soil of the Hardinja. 3 moons had passed since Sigurd the Fat's blood had cooled in the surf, and the rich fort of Hunstock had become something more than a refuge. It was now a forge. Day and night, the valley rang with the iron clash of the smiths. From the wild screes of the north to the small, hidden creeks of the outer islands, men who hated Jarl Erik had begun to trickle in. They came in small groups, 3 men in a leaky fishing skiff, 5 brothers walking over the high glaciers with nothing but their grandfather's rusted ringmail in their packs. Torstein Sigurdsson stood in the smoke of the great smithy, his left arm bound tightly against his chest in a sling of wolfhide. The wound had healed into a thick, twisted rope of purple flesh that throbbed whenever the rain came off the sea, but his right hand was still strong enough to lift the heavy forging hammer. "The charcoal is running low, Torstein," Kveldolv said, throwing a heavy green pine log onto the heap outside the forge door. The giant was stripped to the waist despite the freezing drizzle, his massive torso covered in soot and old scars. "We've melted down every spade, every kettle, and every iron pot from here to the Ormtongue. If we want more iron for spears, we'll have to dig up the old graves. The dead don't need spears, Thorstein said, his eyes fixed on the glowing orange bar of bog iron that the smith was beating into a broad axe head. But the living will need them before the hay turns yellow. What news from the outer islands? 3 more longships came in under the mist last night, Kveldulv replied, spitting into the slack vat. Led by Thorkel the Tall, from the Sunfjord. He brought 40 men, but their timbers are rotten. They had to stuff the seams with wool and cow dung to keep the sea out. Can they row? They can row until their lungs burst, Kveldulv grinned. But they are hungry, Thorstein. The Jarl's men took their winter corn. If we don't lead them to a fat granary soon, they'll start looking at each other's horses. Thorstein stepped out of the smoke into the cold, sharp air of the yard. Hunstock was no longer the quiet village of farmers it had been when his brother Sigmund spoke the law. The courtyard was packed with rough timber sheds where men slept on wet straw. Ulfnar, the wolfcoats, did not sleep inside the walls. They stayed on the high rocks above, their small tallow fires flickering in the dark like the eyes of watching beasts. They spoke to no one, but every morning, 3 or 4 fresh elk carcasses would be left at the fort gate, their throats cut cleanly from ear to ear. The Council of the Broken Rings. That evening, the leaders of the fractured northern clans gathered in the partially rebuilt hall of Hunstock. They sat on rough pine benches around a single, low fire trench. There was no mead left, only sour whey and thin barley broth served in wooden bowls. At the head of the table sat Thorstein, with Halvar standing behind his right shoulder. The boy now carried Viper's tongue, the iron head polished until it reflected the orange light of the peat coals like a mirror. We have 80 ships, Thorkel the Tall said, leaning over the grease-stained table. He was a man with arms as long as oar shafts and a face split by an old sword cut that had taken his left ear. But 40 of them are small fishing boats that will flip if the North Sea hits them flat. Jarl Erik has the great dragon ships from Alrekstad, the Naglfar's Wolf, the Sea Serpent, and 30 others built of old oak with high prows. They will run over our small craft like a horse stepping on mice. Then we don't meet them on the open water, Halvar said, his voice loud and steady in the crowded hall. Several of the old captains looked up, their brows furrowing at the audacity of a youth speaking before his elders. But Thorstein did not silence the boy. He merely watched him with his cold, grey eyes. The Jarl's fleet is gathered at Alrekstad, Halvar continued, stepping forward and drawing a line in the grease of the table with his fingernail. The harbor there is narrow, shaped like a fat horn. If we go in by day, their high decks will rain iron down on our heads. But if we go in when the tide turns at midnight, when the fog comes off the marshes, their big ships will be trapped against the stone piers like fat sheep in a pen. And the chain? Thorkel the Tall grunted. The Jarl has an iron boom across the mouth of the harbor. It's as thick as a man's thigh, held by 2 stone towers. You can't row through iron, boy. We don't row through it, Thorstein said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the captains like a cold wind. We break the towers from the land before the ships arrive. The Black Oath. Thorstein stood up, his blue wool cloak falling back to reveal his scarred, unarmored chest. He reached down and drew his short axe, driving the point deep into the pine wood of the table. Jarl Erik thinks we are wolves caught in a trap, Thorstein said, looking each man in the eye. He thinks we will wait here until the winter ice melts completely so he can come with his great fleet and burn what little we have left. He does not know that the men of the Hardinja have forgotten how to weep. He looked up at the rafters, where the soot from Halder the Black's feast had turned the wood into a dark, greasy velvet. We do not fight for land anymore, Thorstein said, his voice dropping into a register that made the hair on the back of Halvar's neck stand up. We do not fight for silver or for the right to call a strip of mud our own. We fight so that when the poets sing of the last days of the North, they say that the men who died at Alrekstad made the Jarl's throne so slippery with blood that no man could ever sit on it again. He reached out his right hand, wrapping his fingers around the cold iron hilt of the sack sticking out of the wood. Who rows with me? Kveldulv was the first to stand, his massive hand crashing down onto Thorstein's knuckles. My axe is yours, Sigurdsson. Until the crows have my meat. Thorkel the Tall looked at the two of them, a slow, grim smile spreading across his scarred face. He rose, his long arm reaching across the table to grip the steel. The Sunfjord men will row. But if we die in the dark, Thorstein, you owe me a horn of mead in the old man's hall. If we die in the dark, Thorstein said, the old man will come down to row the boat himself. One by one, the 30 captains of the northern creeks stood up, their hands joining over the iron blade until the table groaned under the weight of their iron rings. Outside, the wind from the north began to howl again, rattling the loose shingles of the roof as if the world itself were sharpening its teeth for the harvest.